Hello world, and welcome to Beamstream. So today I actually want to talk about something that us as developers kind of have a certain sentiment about, generally speaking, of course. So for today's video, I want to talk about the sentiment of the original, response that we get when it comes to writing tests in the context of writing front-end code. So actually, what is it that makes writing tests such an unforgiving sort of process as part of our development, right? So oftentimes they can be complex to set up when a component does too many things, when it's quite a smart component as opposed to a dumb component, we end up with complexity, right? Sometimes they can also feel ceremonious, and therefore the tests that you write often have repeated code blocks where, for example, it's doing the same test, but you make different assertions to kind of separate what you're testing, which kind of makes sense, but regardless, it's repeated code. Um, but then you get the opposite side of that, right? Where you have assertions bloat, as I like to call it. Now, obviously, it sometimes makes sense to test more than one thing, depending on how many dependencies there are. Like, if a component uses some form of data layer, some form of service, we need to mock and assert certain function calls, for example, while also integration testing the component behavior. And then the last sentiment, generally speaking, of course, is that writing tests is just not fun. Now, this could be as a consequence of all the reasons said above. But what is it that really drives this sentiment? So let's actually have an example of a component test that we would write for a given component. So here I have one component that I use for Beamstream. So just for context, let me just actually run the app that I have. Just give it some time, and in the meanwhile, I will open up a browser. Okay, cool. So this is the website called Beamstream, and the component that I'll be testing today is actually quite a large encompassing component where I want to test lots of behaviors. Now, obviously, this could be arguable that maybe because it's testing a large part, it should be an end-to-end test. But we can put that topic aside for now. If we open up the DevTools, the component that I'll be testing is actually surrounding this component specifically. We have this filter stream list component. Now, it's responsible for a couple of things. While all of the components are separated into nested, reusable components, this is the all-encompassing one. Now, if we look at the feature sets that we have a programming languages filter, a languages filter, and different categories, right? And alongside that, we have the refresh button, the preview type, like text only, or the default one. For now, I've written tests specifically to do with the filters, right? That's what I wanted to test. So let's actually have a look at how everything looks. For the sake of this example, I am going with the most infamous framework that's kind of known for having a complex setup when it comes to writing component tests on the front end. So let's have a look, right? We have a component, a fixture, and then some mock data that we assign at the start of a test. We assign the languages it should have, and then the programming languages. And then we have a before each loop. We have configure testing module, which kind of is saying, get me all of, well, set up all of the modules that's concerned with this component. So already we're receiving complexity where we have to kind of figure out what we want to mock. So this is one of the first issues. It looks like there's a lot of bloat, right? And this is something that can be quite hard and complex to set up. But I digress. Let's carry on. We set initial input values for the given components. That is the stream list, the available languages, and the available programming languages. And then we detect a change for where the screen renders with a list of streams. Okay, cool. Now, the first step, or one of the practices that I've found to actually work, is that when things are done quite a few times, just like how we would do for our implementation, it makes sense to extract these things to functions or helper classes and so on. I think one of the sentiment really is we don't look after our tests the way that we look after our implementation. So in the same concept, I've extracted a bunch of utilities that will help drive writing tests. So let's have a look at the utils or the utils mock file. I have a bunch of helper functions that will make writing tests a lot less cumbersome, right? So, for example, with sorting categories, specifically to do with the left side, I want to be able to test each one and check if they have been sorted correctly. So let's have a look, right? We go to the drop down and then we trigger the event mouse over that will bring down the drop down menu. And now we can start testing for different categories. By default, it's most popular, so we test for most popular. Now, you would have all of the implementation within this, but it makes sense to extract this into a function, and that's exactly what I did, right? I have this function called sort most popular, and then alongside that, I map it to get all of the user logins. And then from the user logins, I get all the usernames from a stream card. So what I'm testing is that all of these usernames are correctly ordered from the DOM, right? So this is a way to kind of make tests clean. Now I use this function quite excessively actually, which is a good thing. That's the point of functions, right? Kept moving on. If we switch the category to needs love, we can then, we do the same thing. In this case, we get all the options, we find the option called needs love, and then we click on that option, and then we wait for the screen to render again. And once again, we use another reusable function called sort needs love, and then we get all of the stream cards. Now notice, all of these are quite simple to interpret as a developer, right? Everything are in appropriately named variables. I think part of the reason why this sentiment really exists is that we just don't look after things with tests as we do with our implementation. And I think that's the point that I kind of want to get across. So moving on, this looks good enough. I mean, this could be better, right? Like this point where we trigger an event handler with some context. It seems like the API for Angular's sort of element API isn't that great, because what if there is no context to our clicked event, right? And so these are the sort of problems that I find when actually using the native framework. And the native testing framework, of course. So this is where I kind of want to drive home that, okay, we've actually extracted most things in a reasonable way. This is good enough, right? But maybe it may come down to actually rethinking whether there might be something better, something that will motivate us to further look after our tests even more. So this is where you go for considerations like trying to find a much better test framework abstraction over a given framework or library. And what I mean by that is essentially introduce a better test runner API. So for the sake of this example, I also have a test file that uses a library, a testing library for Angular called Spectator. So if we have a look at our Spectator file, we can see a much different approach to how we go about testing. So starting right off the bat, we see all of the test setup, right? So let's have a look. On the left is the original, and on the right is using Spectator. So Spectator has gone with the approach of factories. It makes sense, right? There's nothing crazy about the setup. It's nothing intuitive, although it does give fewer lines of code to set up. For example, the services. The services are sort of assumed to all be set up by default or mocked entirely. So it makes that assumption, which is a pretty good assumption, unless you want explicitly mocked data. So that's one win over, right? It's the fact that all of the providers are mocked by default. The second part, obviously, we set up the mock data for the languages and available languages. And then we come to this before each section, which sets all of the inputs, the input test data for the component. So if we compare over here, we actually are more explicit about what we want to set, right? So specifically with a given component, so this filter stream list component, we are explicitly setting the input, unlike the one on the left, where all we're doing is actually implicitly applying a value to an attribute for a component, which kind of makes sense, but it might be better to have a more ergonomic API just by having a named function to be able to set this up, right? So moving on now, let's actually check and compare what is different about these tests, right? So there's not much different in rendering all of the stream cards and checking the length of them, apart from the way that we query the APIs. So no change over there. Now, moving on to sorting by categories would have possibly the biggest change, right? Because it's even less lines of code. And obviously, sometimes less line of code isn't the best, but let's just have a look at the API. I'm going to skip the default option and instead go to the needs love sort of test. So on the left, we've had to make actually a few helper functions to allow us to, write things a lot neater, a lot more understandable. But on the right, it's only concerned with, so I am only using the API provided by Spectator. For example, the click mechanism. I've had to actually find the element first, and then I can trigger the event handler. On the right, I can do this all in one line, searching by text that an option should have a needs love option, to which we then trigger the event click. So this is quite a big change to me, right? Like if I was to go around and write tests, this seems a lot more ergonomic, a lot more understandable, and definitely less testing sort of utilities that I will need to make. So far, the only utility that I've made is the assertions that I need, which is fine, right? So you can really see the shift when it comes to the left native way of the framework handling tests and a testing library that's made a lot nicer, a lot more ergonomic, and a lot more understandable. And so that's really the point that I want to drive. It's the fact that actually sometimes the developer sentiment is not about their ability. It's everything mostly emotional, where sometimes it's just tedious to write because we don't look after them the way that we do for implementation. And that's really the point that I want to kind of drive home. It's being able to write the tests, you know, understandably and maintainably to hopefully allow the developer to then reuse the same test setup and making small changes. So to kind of conclude from the points made throughout the video, it's important to create reusable functions, and it's important in the same way to create reusable assertions. Consider that another test library is probably better for uh, the current test framework that's used. In this case, for Angular, I am already using a new test framework just because it makes my life easier and it motivates me to write more tests. And lastly, obviously, look after your tests with the same sentiment as you would for your implementation. I think with all things said in this video, I hope that helps or possibly gives you motivation to improve testing so that, you can finally have fun with it as much as possible. Um, and that's really it. So thanks for watching, and if you like the video, please leave it a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching.